Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. The update 36 patch notes are upon us and actually pretty mild compared to what we have been seeing from the earlier updates this year. So in this video, I'll go through the new Overland, Craftable, and Mythic sets. We'll talk about some of the quality of life stuff and then break down the combat balance changes, and I'll give some feedback on that. To start off, let's go through the new Overland sets, and thanks to ESOsets.com for the tooltips here. Great website, I'll have them linked in the description below. First, we have Back Alley Gourmand, a light armor set. It has crit chance, weapon and spell damage, and then while you have a food buff active, your critical damage and critical healing is increased by 13%. So this is pretty solid overall. I ran a few comparisons for a few different types of scenarios up against some of the other really easy to get early sets like this one, and all of these numbers were run with UESP's build editor. Highly recommend if you are into theory crafting. So this first scenario is without raid buffs, possibly some stats you'd see if you're running around solo or with the pickup group, and you can see that it's actually pretty close to what you'd get from Order's Wrath here. Orders is less than 1% ahead. I was also kind of surprised to see that Hundings and Julianos were a bit ahead of Leviathan and Mother Sorrow, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. With less optimized settings, your weapon and spell damage and also your crit damage are generally much lower, which favors the Hundings and Julianos bonus a little over the crit chance from Sorrow or Leviathan. And then switching over to 6 medium instead of 6 light, same sort of deal here. The results still are pretty similar overall. So definitely looks to be a solid option, assuming you are getting that full 13% crit damage bonus. Now remember, there is a cap of 125% crit damage, but you often won't have to worry about hitting that outside of optimized scenarios. So looking at it again, this time with raid buffs active, I'll go back to the 6 light setup. So the numbers I specifically put here still allowed for the wearer to get the full use of that 13% crit damage. So keep that in mind with these specific results. Mostly the same, and as expected, Leviathan and Mother Sorrow jumped a little bit ahead of Hundings and Julianos, since we do have the higher crit damage levels now. And then Order's Wrath is a little further ahead of Back Alley Gourmand in this scenario, but it's less than a 1% difference still. But this is a very specific scenario where you still would get that full 13% crit damage. And that's the main issue here. There are many other ways you could make up that crit damage that's missing, which would render Back Alley Gourmand pretty ineffective. And that's really the biggest drawback to the set, and why it won't be super common at the upper end game with us having that crit damage cap. If we do swap over to medium armor, here's another example. This puts us already really close to that crit damage cap, only 3% away, and so most of that 13% bonus ends up wasted, and it falls down to last place of these sets. And you can see that Order's Wrath is still barely holding on to that top spot in this scenario over Leviathan and Mother Sorrow, even only benefiting from 3% of that total 8% crit damage that it offers, but that's because Order's Wrath also has some crit chance on it too. And only a 0.1% difference here. Definitely interesting to see how Leviathan and Mother Sorrow move up the ranks the closer we get to those capped crit damage amounts compared to our other easy to get early options. And just keep in mind that all of these are just specific gear setups and scenarios. You'll always have to look at your specific setup to decide what is right for you. But overall, the set has solid stats on it. It's a great early set to pick up if you're just getting started, or even in later end game, it's still a decent option to run for less optimized encounters. Order's Wrath is still my go-to as far as the top easy to get sets go, and it has the benefit of being craftable, so you can make it in whatever weight you need, while Back Alley Gourmand is light only. But for an Overland set, it is pretty impressive. We don't always get Overland options that are very relevant. It's nice to see this one introduced. Next up is the medium Overland set, Phoenix Moth Theurge. It has stamina recovery, maximum stamina, and then healing yourself or an ally grants the target minor courage and minor force for 10 seconds, increasing their weapon and spell damage by 215 and their critical damage done by 10%. This effect can occur once every 12 seconds per target. I think this could be a pretty decent set in PvP. For PvE, this is actually still kind of intriguing as a niche support option. It definitely doesn't slide in as one of your core staple support sets with a maximum of 83% uptime on both of those buffs, but it's not a bad pair of bonuses to bring. For one, it wouldn't be hard to fit into your composition, as you could drop Yolnahkriin since this gives that same bonus, assuming perfect uptime using each of these sets so that that would be 100% uptime with Yolnahkrin and 83% uptime with this new set, you'd end up losing out on somewhere around 50 weapon and spell damage on average, but you'd get that minor force buff also added in, and for more AoE heavy boss fights, Zogvin has been a very popular option for the DPS to wear to give them some extra bar space to drop their minor force ability and slot another AoE damage ability. So with this set going, you wouldn't need your DPS in Zogvin, and they could go a different route, a different 5-piece bonus with a little more damage on it. However, I'm not sure how much any of that I just said is going to actually matter, because there is one big drawback to this set that I have not mentioned yet, aside from that cooldown period, and that is that the heal actually has to heal for missing health for the bonus to apply. It does not activate on an overheal. Unfortunately, this means for many encounters that the uptime on it would not be very great. So considering it only gives a maximum uptime of 83%, I'd love to see this change to also apply with overheals, or have the cooldown meet the duration if it's not going to apply with overheals. Regardless, it won't be a super popular option for PvE support either way, but if it at least applied on overheals, I could see it working its way into a few specific encounters. And then the last Overland set is a heavy set, Bastion of Droif. This adds stamina, health, stamina, and then blocking an attack grants you a stack of inflection for 10 seconds, up to 3 stacks max. You can gain up to 1 stack every 0.5 seconds. Increase your magicka and stamina recovery by 106 per stack of inflection. 313 magicka and stamina recovery total on this, and it seems like that timer will just keep refreshing each time that you block, so it should be pretty easy to keep up. Not bad for sustain. Seems like it maybe could have some use in PvP. However, I don't see this one really having an effect on PvE gameplay though. Alright, let's move on to the craftable options. The first is Chimera's Rebuke. This gives max magicka, max health, max stamina, and then gaining resources from a fully charged heavy attack also restores 2363 of the gained resource to the 3 allies nearest to your target. I think this is a pretty interesting concept, especially since there's no cooldown on that. So if someone in your group was doing a heavy attack build and wearing this, you'd be topped off pretty much all the time. It does have the downside that it only restores the resource that they are restoring. So if you were a stam build and they were mag, you wouldn't really have a lot of benefit unless you were running a setup really heavy on magicka abilities. And it also only goes to 3 nearby allies, so wouldn't be great for trials either. Kind of an interesting idea for sure, but I don't really see it working its way into endgame for PvE. Next up is Old Growth Brewer. This gives stam recovery, mag recovery, health recovery, and then after drinking a potion, you get 245 magicka, stamina, and health recovery for 45 seconds. This is a fair bit of recovery for sure. Comparing it to Amber Plasm, it has similar stats, but with Amber Plasm having more offensive 2 to 4 piece bonuses. The benefit of Old Growth Brewer is that it could be single barred. You just have to make sure to drink your potions on the correct bar, but the condition is pretty easy for it, and it lasts the full duration of your potions. Comparing it to something like Wretched Vitality, another craftable set that can also be single barred, you don't get quite as much overall, but Old Growth has a bit easier condition with a longer duration. I'd probably still prefer Wretched if going with a recovery set for PvP, but this one isn't too bad either. And then the last craftable set is Claw of the Forest Wraith. This gives crit chance, weapon and spell damage, crit chance, and then adds 2037 crit chance to your class abilities. And that 2037 is the equivalent of about 9.3% crit chance. So this is kind of like innate axiom, except you're getting crit chance instead of weapon and spell damage. Essentially, to see what kind of 5-piece bonus that you'll be getting from this, you'll need to know the percent of your damage that can crit, and then from there, the percent of that damage that is your class skills. So I compared this up against those same sets we looked at earlier, all of the easy to get early options. So if 50% of our damage that could crit was from class abilities, then it comes out just behind Hundings and Julianos. Moving that to 60%, it would be just ahead of them and right behind Leviathan and Mother's Sorrow. If we had 75% of our critable damage from class abilities, then it would put it ahead of those, just behind Back Alley Gourmand, and it would take 90% of our damage to be from class skills to actually pass it, and even then it would still be short of Order's Wrath. But this is also assuming that Order's Wrath and Back Alley Gourmand are fully benefiting from their crit damage bonuses in this 6 light armor setup. So if we move over to medium in the the same scenario we talked about earlier where we're already almost at the crit cap, meaning that most of those crit damage bonuses on orders and back alley end up wasted. You can see in this specific scenario, it would only take 66% of our damage being from class skills for this to win out among the easy to get early sets. So at first glance, this didn't seem like too high of a mark to reach, but I wanted to take a look at the actual damage numbers from a current combat metrics report for update 36. So big thanks to GoAvs for sharing his Magicka Templar parse with me. I figured Templars would have a pretty high percent of their damage coming from class abilities. So after removing Zon and Reliquin from the equation here, since those cannot crit, we have close to 87% of our damage that can crit. And then 47% of our overall damage ended up coming from class skills, which meant that 54.6% of our overall damage that could crit in this scenario would be boosted by Claw of the Forest Wraith. So if we take that percentage and plug it back into those comparisons that we were doing earlier with these easy to get early sets, it puts it almost dead even with Hundings and Julianos. Kinda meh overall, and when you consider that Hundings and Julianos would affect Zon and Reliquin's damage, but the crit chance would not, doesn't look too good. If he was doing jabs here instead of Blazing Spear spam, it might have pushed it up a tiny bit more to make it above Hundings and Julianos. But I also checked the current Nightblade parse as well, and it was only about 45% of the damage that would have been boosted. So overall, for most stuff, I don't think this set is super relevant. We just end up with too much of our damage that doesn't come from class skills in almost all endgame DPS builds. I could see some Oakensoul setups possibly doing well with this. Since you are reduced down to 5 active skills, many classes may end up with all class abilities on their bars. So in that specific situation, it could be one of the best easy to get early options for sure. This particular setup is from Saligia's Nightblade guide. I'll have it linked in the description if you're interested in digging into that. But yeah, overall, not super impressed with this for PvE, but maybe a few niche setups, maybe with Oakensoul, could get some use out of this one. And that's it for the new 5-piece sets, but we also have 3 mythics coming. The first one is a medium chest, Fawn's Lark Cladding. If you continuously sprint for 1 second, you gain the ability to pass through enemies. Enemies you pass through become charmed for 4 seconds, removing their ability to attack or cast abilities as they move towards you. Charming an enemy this way restores 678 stamina and magicka to you and heals you for 678 health. Charming an enemy removes you from stealth. So this set is kind of funny, but ultimately I don't see a lot of practical use in PvE for it. I thought maybe you could just run through all of the ads in a dungeon or something and skip them, but you don't lose aggro. They still chase you. They just don't start attacking until after that 4 seconds. And then for PvP, I tested this as well, and you can just break free from the charm. So you don't have to wait that full 4 seconds without attacking. And then while you are CC immune, the charm cannot be applied to you either. It might be interesting for running into a keep or something, just having a tiny bit more wiggle room to get through. I don't know. It seems like a bit of a stretch to be classified as a mythic item. I wish it did something a little extra on top of the effects that it currently has. It feels a little too gimmicky right now for me. Next up, we have Light Legs, Stormweaver's Cavort. Adds 300 magicka recovery. Sprint, roll dodge, bash, break free, sneak, and block now consume magicka instead of stamina. You cannot regain magicka while blocking, sneaking, or sprinting. You can gain stamina while blocking, sneaking, or sprinting. So pretty much just flip-flops those resources and how they're used there. It's a pretty interesting concept, but similar to Fawn's Lark, it doesn't seem quite mythic enough. The idea is cool to be able to build differently and use your magicka pool for all those core combat abilities, but at the end of the day, it's only 300 magicka recovery that's actually added to you as a bonus for the item. And keep in mind that magicka recovery is not active while you're blocking, sneaking, or sprinting, same as stamina normally is. So I do imagine this will end up being used in some pretty interesting build ideas. Like I said, I do really like the concept of it, but you are giving up the power of another mythic item or a one-piece bonus to make this work. And then finally for the mythics, we have the Heavy Belt, Sirbane's Ward. You cannot move while bracing. While bracing, you create a 12-meter zone of protection. Allies within the zone increase their block mitigation by 30% and their health recovery by 950. The developer comment on this says, the block mitigation and health recovery only affects allies and not the set wearer. Use shield wall with this ability at your own risk, as you won't be able to move for the duration of the ultimate. This one does seem like it probably has the most practical use of the three for PvE, though I'm not sure how often you really need to crank up your allies' block mitigation as a support option. So I think the idea here would be to have someone aside from the main tank to wear this to further support that main tank in their damage taken. If the bonus on this was straight up damage taken reduction or dot damage reduction or something like that, even at a much lower amount, I think this could be really interesting to have someone wear it to further support whoever is taking the big chunks of damage for a particular encounter, but I'm not sure how helpful straight up block mitigation will be. I think in most of the scenarios where tanks are getting super wrecked, it's not from blockable damage. Maybe there's some like niche scenarios where you could have a DPS with the taunt and someone else wearing this and they could eat some of the damage that they normally wouldn't have been able to. I don't know, I'm trying to think outside of the box a little bit with this one. When we were going through this live on stream, chat brought up Starfall and Hell Raw Citadel hard mode. That does seem like a pretty good spot for this, having one person in it. As long as people are blocking, it would greatly reduce the incoming damage from Starfall. Though with the proper group configuration and plan, it isn't too hard to make it through that as is. So if nothing changes with this set, maybe a couple of scenarios where it could be nice to have. As I have time to sit and think about more encounters and the rest of the community does, I'm sure people will come up with something for it, but I'd love to see it offer maybe a smaller amount of block mitigation, but then have some other useful bonus like dot damage reduction on there. But yeah, those are the three new mythics. Overall, between these and the 5-piece sets, nothing that will really shake up metas, I don't think. Just some new strange or niche interactions that we get from these this time through. Alright, moving on to the quality of life section of this video. We did get some new base game stuff added, target markers, hiding pets in towns, housing quality of life improvements, changes to Emperor scaling, armory stations in Cyrodiil and IC, customized actions, and the daily login timer changed to different times on EU and NA. I'm not going to break all of these things down here in this video. Honestly, nothing here that is really super relevant for me personally. Nephis does have an article up on ESOU's website that covers all of this. If you are interested, I linked that in the description. I think he probably did a video going through it as well if you prefer that format. But yeah, there are some nice changes here, but nothing that really blew me away like some of the past quality of life things we've received. I'm still waiting on them to finish that hybridization system up. That would be my #1 quality of life request. We keep getting patch after patch with it not being finished. We need our jewelry glyphs to be hybridized for weapon and spell damage, as well as our potions for major brutality and sorcery, along with major prophecy and savagery. And then there's still this issue with our class passives right now, the minor unique class passives that we bring where you don't actually need all 4 of the base game classes. You can just kind of pick and choose 2 of them. I'd still love to see these minor buffs combined together to give both sides of the crit chance and weapon and spell damage. Then you'd only need those passives on 1 class each, and we could put in 2 unique class passives for whoever was left without it. I don't know, it just feels bad to have gone this long with these things being left behind, but it looks like it will be a year at minimum before the hybridization is done, assuming they do finish it in update 37. I'd also really love to see curated dungeon chests. The newest dungeons, Grave and Deep and Earthenroot Enclave, both of these currently have curated chest drops, and with no official word on this, I guess we have to assume that this is a bug, but a part of me was really hoping that it was just put in a patch early and we'd be getting curated dungeon chests as a thing going forward. Running the new dungeons, it is really exciting to find a chest because you know there's going to be something in there that you haven't collected yet. So my eyes were always peeled going through each section trying to make sure we didn't miss any chests. And that was kind of a cool feeling, as I'm usually just kind of like take it or leave it with chests. If I find them, cool. If not, I'm not really worried about it. But they don't seem to show any signs of slowing for introducing new dungeons. So having chests also be curated could be a really nice way to rein in the overall farm time needed, especially for newer players coming in who just see this massive list of dungeons. And then on top of those things, still everything I put into the video from January of this year, I'd love to see these quality of life changes still come at some point too. This video will be linked down in the description if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole with me. Alright, for the last section of this video, we'll be talking about the combat balance changes. I'm actually pretty relieved that there isn't much here to rock the boat this time around. Pretty mild changes, and for the most part, we can just continue with what we've been doing for update 35. But there are still a few important things to cover, so I'll go through that and give a little feedback on how we might be able to make it better. So first off, they fixed an issue where some ticking AoE abilities could delay or miss their first tick, or could apply their effects out of sync with their tick rates. So I'm not sure what all this affects, but this should resolve the issue with the Maelstrom two-hander where you often miss ticks from its merciless charge effect. I'd imagine this will make for a fairly decent sized percent increase from what we see with the Maelstrom two-hander. However, with it only doing like 2k DPS before, even like a 25% increase, 50% increase, you know, maybe the 2.5 to 3k DPS range now instead of 2k still feels a little low overall. Definitely still a strong option to pair with the two-handed back bar, but that is mostly because two-handed back bar is just nice on its own, whereas the Maelstrom staff really adds closer to like 4 to 5k DPS to your unstable wall. I'd still like to see something a little more exciting done with the Maelstrom two-hander, but bug fixes are always good. For class changes, we didn't have a whole lot here. Dragonites just had a bug fix with their shifting standard. Templars did get an interesting change to Backlash. This is Power of the Light and Purifying Light. The final damage now deals a guaranteed amount of damage based on your highest offensive stats, rather than dealing damage based on the damage it took from you over the duration, and with a cap based on your weapon or spell damage. So now you can run either morph regardless of stacking into weapon or spell damage. This is now fully hybridized. And unlike the previous iteration of the skill, even if you completely stopped attacking your target after casting it, you'd still have some damage go out from the final explosion. That damage will just scale higher based on how much damage you deal to the target. So the final damage deals approximately 10% more damage than the initial hit at base, and increases up to an additional 200% to reach similar values of power seen before. The final damage now takes more overall damage to reach to make the payout less reliably reached in PvP scenarios. These abilities are now once again limited to having one active at a time to fix numerous exploits and bugs with the ability. This means if you cast the ability on another target while it's active, it will remove the previous cast. And then Power of the Light increased the duration of Minor Breach from this morph to 10 seconds, up from 9. This effect is also no longer tracked over the base ability, with the ability timers option enabled to help you keep track of the core ability instead. So my initial reaction based off just reading the patch notes here, I think mostly all good changes, with a few niche scenarios where you would be negatively affected by not being able to cast it on multiple targets at the same time. But I do want to go back to one thing that they said. The final damage deals approximately 10% more damage than the initial hit at base, and increases up to an additional 200% to reach similar values of power seen before. So first off, they don't list how much damage that takes from you to get from 10% to 200%. So it'd be nice to have some kind of clarification from them on that, or some kind of wording in the tooltip that tells us how much we need to actually max that out. And then also they said similar values of power seen before. So when they said similar here, I assumed it would be roughly the same damage range. But thank you GoAvs again for this testing information. After comparing the new Pottle explosion to the old, it is definitely a fair bit down from what it was in update 35. I wouldn't call this similar values of power. I'm not sure if this is an intended result or not. I mean, an 18% decrease in the max hit seems fairly significant. And this is also with the skill scaling with Bloodthirsty now, which it did not before. So these max hits are only towards the end of the encounter, whereas previously the max hits were consistent all the way through. I think this might have something to do with the aggressive scaling that it used to have with weapon and spell damage. So at very low weapon and spell damage amounts, this might actually even be a buff over the old version. But at the very high amounts we get, like on the trial dummy or in an organized raid, the old version was really cranked up since it was only scaling with that weapon or spell damage, and it was scaling at a much higher rate than a normal skill would. So it kept going further and further and further ahead of the pack. Whereas now it's going to be consistently going up in damage with all of your other skills. So I think maybe like somewhere in the middle of like the stats you'd normally get, this is probably similar in power, but when you get into those high-end scenarios, it's now a pretty decent sized nerf. But it's still a really strong skill overall regardless. Even in these high-end scenarios, it's definitely still worth running. I don't think it's the end of the world. If they did indeed plan to nerf this, it just wasn't presented as a nerf, so I'm a bit confused on if that was intended or not. Maybe something needs to be revisited here. Otherwise, not really going to affect the way we use it, other than not being able to apply it to multiple targets. It's still a really strong single target damage ability. Would be nice to just get a little clarification on that though. All right, let's move on to Wardens. They did receive the majority of the changes for classes in Update 36. First is to the Advanced Species passive. This passive now increases your critical damage done by 3% rather than armor penetration by 990. So I'm not really sure how I feel about this change for PvE purposes. Essentially, they've just gone from one capped stat to a different capped stat. I think this passive would have been fine staying as a percent damage done passive like it used to be, considering all of the other nerfs that the Warden got alongside of that change in Update 35. So I'd love to see this go back to something that is a little more universal for all scenarios, like percent damage done, crit chance, status effect chance. Really would be nice to just see this change to anything that is not tied to a capped stat. Then moving on to Arctic Blast, it had its target cap removed, so no longer limited to hitting 6 enemies at a time. And then the other big change was to Piercing Cold. This passive now increases your damage done by 2%, which increases to 10% while wielding an ice staff, rather than increasing your magic and frost damage by 10%. So pretty much if you are using any sort of weapon besides an ice staff, this passive is just a flat 2% damage done bonus affecting all of your damage. And then if you are using an ice staff, this is a flat 10% damage done bonus affecting all of your damage. So the developer comment says, this passive is currently creating issues with morph choices in the class as Wardens have a healthy mix of damage types outside of magic and frost. Many morphs that are meant to focus on damage are either close to or even eclipsed by the more utility driven morphs that retain magic damage. So Deep Fissure versus Sub-Assault here is a good example of that. And the lack of more DPS focused ice damage abilities, since they are predominantly made for tanks or utility, create a situation where this passive isn't helping the unique identity of ice mages keep up with the other playstyles. By shifting the focus of the passive over to generic damage that contextually gets stronger for the audience the passive is made for, we hope to help bring that playstyle up a bit more. So the overall direction of this passive I really like. You give up quite a bit of damage to use ice staves, so having a passive that shrinks that gap a bit is really cool for the Frost Wardens out there. The main issue with this passive right now is that 2% damage done bonus for the non-frost staves. Considering the previous iteration of this passive, it was 10% to our frost damage and our magic damage abilities. So all it would take from that old passive to match what we're getting now is 20% of our total damage coming from those ability types. And it was generally a fair bit higher than that, even using the Sub-Assault morph instead of Deep Fissure. So if you were using Deep Fissure for many standard PvE builds, it's likely that somewhere in the 35% to 40% range of your damage was coming from magic and frost damage abilities. And so that would be the equivalent of like a 3.5 to 4% overall damage gain from the old version of this passive. And then if you're using Sub-Assault, probably like 25 to 30% of your damage is in the ice and magic category. So that would be like 2.5 to 3% overall damage gain from the old passive. Either way, the 2% is going to come out as a nerf for most builds. And so if Wardens were overperforming, then fair enough, but they are currently the lowest DPS of all 6 classes, so to have them even further nerfed with this change just feels really unwarranted. Maybe this would be fine here at that 2% mark if they went back to the percent damage done passive on Advanced Species instead of the crit damage they're going with. Otherwise, I think this needs to be at a minimum 4% damage done here just to avoid it being a nerf, and that doesn't account for Wardens needing to be buffed. So hopefully this could be buffed up a tiny bit higher and that Advanced Species passive back to 2% damage done per ability slotted from that skill line, at least one or the other, so that they aren't getting nerfed even further for this patch. I think with those two things, overall Wardens would at least be reaching the rest of the pack at the low end instead of sitting far behind like they are right now. There were a couple of bug fixes with Warden as well, with Feral Guardian getting stuck in a loop and with Budding Seed centering its final heal on the caster rather than the circle. So it's nice that those got resolved. Moving on, we have another fix to Volley where it was only scaling with your weapon critical, not your spell critical. So should be a little bump for certain builds out there. And then resolving Vigor, this is the selfish morph of this skill, reduced the healing from this morph by approximately 10%. And yeah, this was probably warranted. This ability was insanely strong and should still be a really good heal even with the nerf. And then Khajiits had their class passive adjusted. Nothing too crazy here, just 90 recovery across the board now instead of it being split with 100 health recovery and 85 magicka and stamina. There were also a couple of fixes to sets as well. Besides Mania is now going to boost your pet damage, so this is pretty nice on sorcerers and necromancers who might be using this set. Previously, it only boosted damage that came directly from the user's abilities, and pets did not count. It doesn't mention anything about proc sets or enchantments. Beside did not previously boost those either, so I'm not sure if anyone has looked at that. Let me know in the comments if you have, but at the minimum, it will at least boost the pet damage now. And then Sororia had its bug fixed where you could get stacks while outside of the Sororia AoE. This made it ridiculously easy to keep up on any kind of encounter, and it is normally a set that should be a little more difficult to maintain that bonus on for mobile encounters considering how high the bonus is. Another little miscellaneous thing that was fixed in case you missed it, you can now accept a daily alchemy writ even if you just turned one in from a previous day. So this is nice if you like to pick up all your writs on one day and then do twice as many the next day. They had bugged out the alchemy writs after some other bug fixes they did on it, so glad to see that that's resolved. So overall, the patch notes were pretty light this time compared to the rest of the year, and I think that is what a lot of players were actually hoping for. I would have still liked to see some more impactful quality of life changes. I'd like a bit of clarity on whether the Templar's backlash skill was meant to be a nerf, and I think Wardens are heading in the right direction, but could use a bit further tweaking on some of the numbers. Overall, I think I'm pretty good with most of this though, and it's nice to just be able to relax a bit going into a patch and not really have to change much up from what we're already doing. So hopefully we can get some more of this on the balance side of things going forward, but with some more impactful quality of life and gameplay systems added in on top of it. That's going to do it for this video. Thanks a bunch for stopping by. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, maybe consider doing so if the content has been useful. It definitely helps me out a lot. Let me know in the comments what you think about these changes and how you're feeling about Update 36 overall. A big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Link is in the description if you're interested in helping out that way. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougar is Bay in the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Nolandia, Florian, Vidridi, Cha-Cha, and Unemployed. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.